For what feels like a century now, we've had this constant discourse about the state of cinema, how movies aren't what they used to be, how everything is a sequel or a remake or a superhero film, how Hollywood has no new ideas and they're out of touch and there's no more movie stars. I mean, there is a massive laundry list of critiques of modern day Hollywood from every angle imaginable. And I'm not here to say that all those are wrong. In fact, most of those points have merit, especially if you only pay attention to the blockbuster market. I don't think anyone can argue otherwise when it comes to those kinds of movies. There have certainly been better times for the highest grossing films out there.
They say he uses a connection with animals to track his prey. And once you're on his list, there's only one way off.
That being said, if you're someone that really does care about the art form and does pay attention to what is out there and genuinely wants to see good stuff, there are still countless movies every single year that are original, innovative, fun, and worthy of praise. Yes, the top of the market is an absolute mess right now, but to pretend it used to be this wonderland of quality takes an incredible amount of blinding nostalgia and rose-colored glasses. Okay, they released Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 in theaters. They released Mortal Kombat Annihilation in theaters. There have always been an overwhelming amount of garbage movies out there. We just forget about them the more time goes on. As we should, by the way. This does not need to be preserved past our generation.
Never give up hope.
So, no, cinema is not dead, and it won't be for a long time now, but that doesn't mean there aren't casualties of the modern-day Hollywood machine. Musicals, mid-budget dramas, adventure movies, rom-coms, all of them have seemingly been squeezed out of theaters, and even on streaming for the most part, to the point where when one does manage to break through, it's kind of a surprise. Like, oh yeah, a fun rom-com can still come out and make money in 2023, and a musical can still come out and be a major cultural phenomenon. So many of these genres and subgenres are just lying dormant, waiting to be woken up, and for a lot of them, that time might never come. But no genre has been hit as hard in the past 15 years as much as the classic Hollywood comedy. For as long as films have been around, there have been goofy weirdos out there taking their camera and recording themselves doing silly stuff. You can go all the way back to the days of Charlie Chaplin up to Billy Wilder, Mel Brooks, the Zucker brothers, guys like Harold Ramis, Chevy Chase, Bill Murray, Eddie Murphy, Steve Martin, Jim Carrey. I mean, there was never a shortage of comedies being made and never a time that wasn't littered with comedic talent. And when I was growing up in the 2000s, the genre seemed to be as strong as it ever was. You had guys like Jim Carrey that could make any film this gigantic blockbuster hit, machines like Judd Apatow and Adam McKay and Happy Madison that would pump out multiple films every single year with stars like Will Ferrell and Adam Sandler. Owen Wilson and Vince Vaughn had their buddy duo going. Schlubby guys like Paul Rudd, Steve Carell, and Jason Segel had a few hits. Films like Superbad would launch the careers of everyone involved. To say that the genre was in a good place in the 2000s would be a dramatic understatement. Doesn't mean that everything being put out was good. In fact, most of it was pretty awful actually, but enough of it was being made that it didn't really matter. You go back and look at that decade and even up to the mid-2010s, and you can find multiple comedy classics every single year, and they made money too, like a lot. Meet the Parents made over $300 million. Bruce Almighty and The Hangover made almost $500 million. Wedding Crashers, Talladega Nights, Superbad, Forgetting Sarah Marshall, 40-Year-Old Virgin, all of them made minimum $100+ million on like $20 million or less budgets. These were sure things that every studio had to put out because it just made too much sense. You could even have the odd high-budget comedy like a Tropic Thunder that cost the same as Venom and make your money back just the same. I mean, even Ted, a movie that if it were to come out today would almost assuredly be dumped on like Prime Video in the middle of March and be watched by hundreds of people, was able to outgross both Pixar and Disney Animation's biggest movies of the same year. And that was just 13 years ago. So what happened? Well, to put it short, a lot.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
Unlike, say, the adventure movie genre that can be tied almost 100% to the rise of the comic book film industry as the reason why they aren't around anymore since they occupy the same space, comedies suffer from what is essentially a perfect storm of issues. Every reality of the modern day movie landscape is working against them, which is why, unlike other genres that fall by the wayside, they seem to be gone in almost an instant. Like we all just woke up one day and realized that there aren't any more new comedies being made, which is kind of what happened. In 2014, 22 Jump Street was the highest grossing comedy of the year and finished 12th at the domestic box office, and in 2015, Pitch Perfect 2 was number 1 at 13th. So not as great as it once was, but the genre certainly was still very much alive at this point. But then, just a year later, it plummets with Ghostbusters 2016 being the top comedy of the year domestically, but all the way down at 21st. And from then on, you'd be hard-pressed to find a comedy film that finishes in the top 40 for the year, let alone the top 10 or 20. Like many things in life, the genre just took an absolute nosedive after the year 2016 because, of course it did. Now, if you really had to pin this question down to one solid answer, the most obvious place to point is just the simple fact that comedies just don't make their money back anymore. You look back in recent years, especially in the mid to late 2010s, and there still were plenty of comedies being put out there because, of course there were. Studios had no reason to think they were suddenly going to stop being financially viable. I mean, again, they were coming off of one of the most successful decades of comedy films in history. And while some movies during this time managed to perform well and net a profit, the vast majority of them bombed and bombed hard. Didn't matter how good they were, didn't matter how much star power they had, or how original they were, or even if they were tied to an existing IP. Across the board, these movies just started to drop like flies. And sure, a lot of that can be put at the feet of the consumer for not supporting them, and it being some kind of indication that people just didn't care about the genre anymore, but that's not exactly an accurate reading of the situation. Yes, it's undeniable that comedies were making less money year over year, but it wasn't a result of the public outright rejecting them directly, more of them being a casualty of the evolution of how people were now consuming media. You see, for years, the way in which a comedy film would be made and make money relied on a few key things. 1, major comedic star power, and 2, long-term cultural relevance and positive word of mouth. Now, we'll put a pin in the star power part of this and come back to that later, but I want to focus in on the cultural relevance angle of this, because this is where the genre has really taken a hit in recent years and why it's been unable to turn a profit. You see, it's easy to look at the budget to box office numbers for a movie and say that it didn't have enough marketing, or it came out at the wrong time, or it just wasn't good, or had too high ambitions, or any of those usual reasons as to why movies fail in theaters. And if you were talking about, say, a Marvel film or a major IP like Jurassic Park or Mission Impossible or Star Wars, those reasons would be the most relevant. But the way a comedy film used to become a hit and the way these modern day white whales studios are chasing after become hits are totally different. A film like The Avengers is front-loaded and sold to the public as this major cultural milestone, something you have to be a part of in the moment as close to opening day as possible. It's an event more than it is a movie meant to stand the test of time. It doesn't mean that films like those can't live on past their moment, but the vast majority of the money they will make is in that very short window right when it comes out. Take the last Harry Potter film, for example, one of the biggest event films of all time and a movie that made well over $1 billion. Okay, the second weekend drop-off for that movie was 72%, which for those of you who don't pay attention to this kind of stuff, is typically an indication of a colossal failure at the box office. For comparison's sake, last year's Borderlands and Kraven the Hunter also had a 72% second weekend drop-off. Okay, that is real fucking bad for virtually every film. But for event films, which are the most viable movies of today, that's kind of just the model for how you turn a profit. It's this flash in the pan type thing that hits early and hits hard, and that's why that kind of movie is still very viable in today's media landscape. The public is always hungry for these major events to be a part of. Sometimes they're easy to predict, sometimes they aren't, but when you get one, you're set for the whole year as a studio. Comedies, on the other hand, never really profited off of that that model. And I don't just mean the extreme example of the event film model, I mean the traditional theater model in general. Yes, plenty of comedies out there have come out in theaters and made their money back and then some, but for most of them, even ones that you would think were these giant box office hits based on their cultural impact, the places they would make their money back is not in the release window, but in the home video sales after the fact. VHS, DVD, Blu-ray, reruns on cable, everything that comes in the months and years after a movie is actually in a theater. That's when these comedies that we all think of as classics and we all know all the lines from became iconic and became part of the cultural zeitgeist. They would slowly spread around via all of these avenues and eventually get to the point where, despite not breaking the bank in the theater, everyone you knew had seen the movie anyway. It just took a few years to get there. You go over to your friend's house and they would have a stack of DVDs like Anchorman or Napoleon Dynamite or Happy Gilmore or whatever, and that's how you'd be exposed to the vast majority of these kinds of movies. It's the exact opposite of the event film model, where they only reach that point with time and word of mouth. Films like Idiocracy, The Thing, Blade Runner, Scott Pilgrim, Showgirls, The Big Lebowski, Office Space were all able to find their audience in the years after their release, despite all of them being box office bombs, and many of them also being panned by critics. Physical media used to give movies like this life. And even films that had life in theaters, like the Disney animated movies, made an absolute killing via physical media. I mean, there wasn't a house in America that didn't have a copy of Mulan or The Lion King or The Little Mermaid on DVD or VHS. And for better or for worse, both physical media and any long amount of time allowed in the cultural zeitgeist just don't exist anymore. In order to break through these days, you have to hit and hit hard and hope you made enough money in those first couple weeks to cover your ass. It's why all these studios are so desperate for cinematic universes and big IPs and recognizable brands and sequels and remakes. It's not that all of our brains have turned to soup. They always have been, or that we just don't care about small movies. That's not true. It's simply that those are the only films that can consistently make a profit without physical media. It's just too much of a risk otherwise. And I'm referring just to the comedy genre for this video, but physical media used to make up a staggering amount of revenue for the film industry broadly, peaking in 2005 at $16 billion for DVD sales alone. That is a gigantic chunk of money to just vanish in a relatively short amount of time, so it's no wonder studios have been pushing all their chips to the center of the table with all these attempts at big event movies. It's their only way of making up all that loss, but unfortunately, that also means that the mid-budget movie space is all but dried up. Even on most streaming platforms, which have directly replaced the space physical media used to occupy, the shows and movies that they sink the most money into are also big event films and recognizable brands and IPs. Sure, you might have the odd Bird Box that suddenly becomes this giant streaming hit overnight, but for the most part, what sells in theaters is also what is being pushed on streaming. Even if a solid mid-budget comedy comes out on those platforms, like last year's Hitman for example, it's simply not able to generate the long-term growth and word of mouth that these kinds of movies used to be able to do with physical media. Every day there's something new, and nothing save for your Wednesdays or your Stranger Things are going to be favored by the algorithm for more than a few weeks. Doesn't matter how good they are or how much people like them, the industry only has room for heavy hitters. I mean, for years before it was gone, the joke with Netflix was that it was more accurately described as the Office streaming service because that's what everyone used it for. And Disney Plus, despite having some decent mid-budget content on there, is apparently mainly used for rerunning Moana 24/7. There's more shows and movies than ever and more options to watch them, and yet it seems like all the same stuff is floating to the top, leaving everything else to be lost in the ever-expanding pit of forgotten streaming content. There is also something to be said about the culture of film criticism these days. In a post-Rotten Tomatoes world, life ain't so good for comedies, because across the board, save for a few exceptions, comedies get absolutely savaged by critics. It's just not a genre that is served well by these aggregate sites. Comedy is subjective by nature, and as a result, those movies are going to, on average, get a much wider range of scores than, say, a safe, heavily curated blockbuster that is built to get that certified fresh fresh rating. And sure, most people aren't checking Rotten Tomatoes or Metacritic before they decide to watch something, but enough people are for it to matter. That green splatter can do a lot of damage to smaller movies, and in our fast-moving climate where people's attention is harder and harder to get, those are the kinds of films that are going to suffer. So between all that and the death of physical media, we're starting to get a clearer picture as to why the genre has taken such a hit in the past decade, but that still doesn't tell us the whole story, because despite all that being true, there is one glaring exception that bucks everything I just mentioned and forces us to dig just a bit deeper. Even in this era of remake after sequel after cinematic universe after soft reboot, the one genre that has not just survived but actually gotten bigger and more popular despite being in that low to mid-budget range are horror films. Horror films consistently make money in the theater. They come out every month of the year. They range from unwatchable to surprisingly clever to occasionally even getting some light Oscar buzz. They run the whole gambit and are about as sure a thing that exists in Hollywood in the year 2025. Unless you dump it right next to the Avengers or don't market it, you are going to make your money back. You can even slowly morph a crowdfunded no-budget cult film into a legit franchise by just throwing a couple $1,000,000 at it and eventually see it outperform Joker 2 at the box office, all without putting all your eggs in one mega blockbuster basket. So, the question is, how are they able to do all that when virtually every other genre these days can't? Well, some of it is just the general high popularity of horror. There will never come a day where the public does not want to see a woman slowly walk around a house and get jump scared. It's just in our DNA at this point. Horror is big right now and most likely always will be. However, if we're comparing the horror genre to the comedy genre and how each of them sells themselves, another major issue for the classic Hollywood comedy starts to rear its head. Star power. Sure, while some horror films out there occasionally throw some money at a big name or build a vehicle around a young, up-and-coming star, the genre does not rely on stars to sell the movies. Horror films generally are much more dependent on their gimmick. Killer in the woods, person in the walls, spooky ghost, demons, some weird A24 thing, maybe a fake-out, non-supernatural threat, creepy doll. I mean, you can do pretty much anything as long as it's a passable enough gimmick. They've built entire franchises around some of the dumbest gimmicks you can think of, and it works because that's what the genre is. When you watch a trailer for a horror film, that is what it's selling you. You could have a cast of complete unknowns or some legacy people, and it's not going to change much at all. Comparatively, when you see a trailer for a mid-budget drama type movie, what it's selling you is only star power. You get those obnoxious trailers that end with a giant list of everyone they got to do the movie. Problem with those though is that will balloon your budget for a relatively minor gain, and that's why those films consistently bomb. Now, comedies don't need the same level of star power most dramas do, but every single comedy film that has ever become a hit and ever was able to compete in theaters had an, at the time, A-list comedian in the lead role. Every so often you might get the odd Napoleon Dynamite that becomes a hit regardless, but generally if you want a hit comedy film, you need a hit comedian. Otherwise, you cross your fingers and hope for the cult hit after the fact. Now, why is this relevant to bring up for this discussion? Well, because the A-list comedian movie stars we all think of, like Will Ferrell or Jim Carrey or Adam Sandler, are a dying breed. That list has not grown much in recent years. In fact, it really hasn't grown at all. We live in a time where there is no shortage of young scream queen talent or just young hot talent in general. In fact, it seems like every year a bunch of new young actors come bursting onto the scene, and while a few of them dip a foot in the comedy world like a Rachel Sennett or an Iowa Debris, none of them are on the same trajectory as those past individuals. Most of those past actors would cut their teeth in the comedy world or try to get on SNL or work the stand-up circuit until they could start starring in movies. That was the end game. Nowadays though, the comedy landscape is completely different because, make no mistake, there are plenty of new talented comedians out there, but the end game for them is now totally different. Yeah, it's still a viable option to try and get in movies and shows and be a star that way, but you could also just work the stand-up circuit, and now with things like YouTube and TikTok, blow up a lot faster by yourself than you could 20 years ago. You can try and get some traction going that way, and then start one of the millions of comedian podcasts, and then do that for a few years, and eventually try to land like a Netflix special. You can maybe do some supporting roles in movies and shows here and there, but if you reach that point, you kind of already made it. You don't need to be a movie star anymore to be a famous comedian. In fact, you can just do all of that and end up being more famous and more popular and have more influence than most movie stars without having to go through all the hassle of being in that industry. The culture is just so much more spread out than it used to be, so you don't have to be at the very top of the mountain or have your own sitcom or be an A-list actor to survive. You just need to find your audience. And that's a good thing too, but it also means that much of the young and up-and-coming talent in the comedy world is not going to be on SNL and then not going to transition into movies. They're just going to stay in their own world and do their own thing. So if you look up comedies that have come out in the past few years, whether they've come out in theaters or been dumped on streaming, most of them star either a few of these aging legends or just a bunch of normal actors. Beverly Hills Cop Axel Foley stars Eddie Murphy, Y2K stars a bunch of random young actors, The Fall Guy stars 2 dramatic actors that were just in Oscar films the previous year. There was an Amazon Prime buddy comedy last year called Brothers that starred everyone's favorite comedians, Josh Brolin and Peter Dinklage. And hell, even Saturday Night, the movie about SNL, stars a bunch of young dramatic actors playing young comedic actors. Now, I'm not trying to say the people in these roles are bad or not funny. In fact, many of them are great in these. Ryan Gosling is as funny as anyone, but these aren't exactly films being sold on their all-star comedy talent. They're just these one-off attempts at trying something weird and different. Importantly though, these are not the media people are going to these days to see their favorite comedians work, and that's the issue. People like Dave Chappelle, Bill Burr, Nate Bargatze, Taylor Tomlinson, John Mulaney, you name them, none of them are starring in these kinds of movies. If you actually want to see them, you go watch their clips on YouTube or TikTok, see their specials, or a podcast, and that's about it. But they aren't movie stars, and they don't need to be. Comedies are just no longer the prime showcase for the current talent in the industry, and without that talent, it's hard for any of these movies to break through in a big way. There's just not any more Will Ferrells out there starring in a new comedy every other year, and chances are, a new one is not going to be walking through those doors. Star power also just doesn't mean what it used to back in the day. Like I said, what films rely on now most are brands and IP, and sure, it's nice to have a big name at the front of that IP, but gone are the days of the public dropping everything to go see a movie just because it has one movie star. The only guy like that left is Tom Cruise, and even his last film could not hold up next to Barbie and Oppenheimer. So for industries like comedy that's all about star power, it's only gonna get rougher out there. It takes a lot these days to grab people's attention, and even more to hold on to it for a long period of time. So as a result, we're gonna see some weird shit being thrown at the wall in the next few years. Mark my words. What the fuck? So, with all this in mind, is it fair to say that the Hollywood comedy is dead? Well, it depends on what you qualify as a comedy. I mean, most movies have a foot in multiple genres or blend genres together in ways that are totally unique. Hell, some movies can't even be pinned down to one genre at all. It's just not a thing we can really measure. So if you want to be loose and generous with what we call a comedy, one could make an argument that the genre really hasn't taken much of a hit at all, only morphed and evolved into something different. Family-oriented animated films are as popular as ever, and the vast majority of those are comedic. Half of the MCU films are unserious and tell a joke every other sentence. I mean, certain entries like a Thor Ragnarok or a Spider-Man Homecoming are about as close to a pure comedy as an action blockbuster can get. Not to mention things like Deadpool, which kind of just goes without saying, and that made over $1 billion not even a year ago. In fact, most major movies these days are inherently comedic. Outside of most horror films or the odd serious blockbuster like an Avatar or an Oppenheimer, most of the top grossing movies follow that silly, quippy MCU type formula, or at the very least tend to be light and unserious. Our appetite for serious films is certainly lower than it used to be, at least at the very top, so in that way, movies with a comedic edge to them tend to land pretty well with audiences. And then of course we have the big pink elephant in the room, which is where I want to end this video on, because I think Barbie is very emblematic of the reality of the modern day Hollywood comedy. Now sure, Barbie isn't your traditional gag-a-minute, simple, down the line comedy like A Naked Gun or an Anchorman. There's obviously a lot more going on with it than your typical studio comedy film. It isn't that by any means, but that's why it's relevant to this conversation, because this is what comedies have to be now to be successful. It's not enough anymore to just have a funny script and funny actors. It has to be large and grand scale and ambitious and crazy and have this great young director behind the camera and be this very unique high concept thing. It's the only way movies can survive in the current attention economy. Comedies need that cultural relevance and shared experience, and that only works if you morph it into the event film that Barbie was. Because there is no time for it to grow in the years after its release, it must come out of the gates swinging. It had to be that big and that expensive and have that level of star power. It's everything comedies have always needed to survive, but just dialed up to a 15 out of 10. Otherwise, it's not going to hit. I mean, just look at Y2K from a couple months ago. If that movie came out in the year like 2007, I bet you anything it would have made a pretty nice haul at the box office and then gone on to sell decent on DVD and be thought of like a Pineapple Express or something like that. Not like a comedy classic or anything, but just something that people have seen and think of fondly. Instead though, it just kinda came and went, and in a few years, most people will have forgotten it ever existed. Hell, even something like Bottoms from 2023, which is one of the funniest things I've seen in years, didn't exactly make a major cultural splash outside of the film nerd community, and it's not the only movie like it. There are still great, simple comedies being made that come out every single year, but they've almost exclusively moved into the indie space. They're like Kevin Smith movies where if you don't pay specific attention to them, you'll have no idea a new one's coming out. And that's fine for all of us who do follow this stuff, but for everyone else, it does kind of mean that the genre is dead in that sense. It just takes so much these days to make your media relevant that everything has to be dialed up and over the top. Barbie is the best case scenario you can hope for, but that's not exactly a thing that can come out on a consistent basis. None of these white whales are, and yet that's where all the money is being funneled and what audiences respond to the most. So, are comedies dead? Well, yes and no. The days of simple premises and spoofs and low-stakes road trip movies and coming-of-age films making it to the big screen and competing with the high-octane action films and big event movies of the time appear to, at least for the time being, be very much a thing of the past. Without the infrastructure to support mid- and low-budget movies, the bottom has just totally fallen out on them. That is all true. The talent has moved elsewhere, the money has dried up, and the way in which we consume media has left a whole lot of good stuff behind. But that doesn't mean it's forever. Audiences' sensibilities may be a fickle mistress, but it also means that things always find their way back at some point. The pendulum, as it has with musicals in the past couple years, is bound to swing back eventually. Might not be the same as it was, but there is always going to be great comedies out there. They just might be a bit harder to find for the time being. Or who knows, maybe this whole industry will come crashing down under the weight of its own $300+ million movies. And really, what's a better comedy than that?